A hurt woman arrives at a stream where she cleans her injury and hears a wolf howl. She enters a cave nearby and kills a fierce animal. At the same time, a girl named Peggy relaxes by the pool, reading a magazine. A boy swims over and invites her to join him, but she declines and glances at her father. Chris observes the gathering from a distance. Belle comes over and hands him a beer. Chris instructs his wife to watch their daughter closely. Belle tells her daughter not to play with that boy. Meanwhile, another child of Chris and Belle sees other boys bothering her, trying to undress her to get a better look. Brian closely monitors their actions. When the party wraps up, he is the first to hop into the car and informs his father that Peggy sometimes hangs out with a boy who walks beside her. This news seems to upset the father. The family heads home. Later that evening, Belle rolls a cigarette for herself, while Chris takes one for himself. That night, Chris rides an ATV into the woods to hunt. The next morning, he arrives at the river and spots the wild woman. He watches her bathe and decides to follow her to discover her home. In the evening, he returns and insists that his family help him clear out the storm shelter. He spends the night inside, working on something. Morning arrives, and Chris goes to the cave, throwing a net over the wild woman. He knocks her out and drags her back home. Meanwhile, Peggy is at school. During class, she feels unwell and heads to the restroom. Brian, who also attends the same school, enters the classroom while other students play outside. He takes a comb from a classmate's backpack and sticks some gum on it. Chris brings the wild woman to the shelter, chaining her to the walls and attempting to examine her mouth. However, she wakes up, spits out a wedding ring, and swallows her finger. Chris yells in agony and strikes the woman in the face. He then enters the house to tend to his injury. Afterward, Chris grabs a gun and heads to the shelter. He tightens the ropes around the woman to prevent her from moving and fires at a wooden board. Chris explains that he did this to get back at her for hurting his finger and to teach her a lesson about her behavior. He returns to the house and insists that the family must go to the cellar together immediately. He tells them he found this woman in the woods and that they will take care of her. Chris sees this as a personal project to transform her into a normal person. He assigns tasks to each family member. Peggy is sent to fetch the first aid kit, while Belle is tasked with bringing food for the woman. They set the plate in front of her and observe closely. The wild woman shatters the plate and snarls at them. Chris remarks that he should have used plastic dishes instead. He takes a rake and pushes the porridge closer to her. He tells her she will have to eat when she gets hungry. Later, the family heads home for dinner. In the evening, Darlene visits the shelter to play music for the woman. Meanwhile, Chris enters Peggy's room to discuss her life. He praises her as a good girl and expresses his love for her. Soon after, Belle questions her husband about whether keeping the woman in the cellar is the right decision. Chris gives her a brief and straightforward response before heading to bed. The next day, Chris goes to work. As a lawyer, he receives documents from his secretary, who discusses ongoing tasks. He treats her with more respect than he does his wife. Meanwhile, Peggy refuses to participate in gym class. The teacher notices her unusual behavior over the past few days. Peggy lies down on the grass and begins to cry. The wild woman struggles to tear the fastening from the wall, but her energy is fading. She bends down and starts eating the porridge. Meanwhile, the secretary pays another visit to her boss. Chris flirts with her and gives her compliments. Later, he picks up his daughter from school, and they drive home together. At that moment, Brian approaches the shelter and slightly opens the door. He sees the woman, but their mother spots him. She scolds Brian and tells him not to go there. When Chris arrives home, he asks his son to feed the dogs. Brian heads to the barn to give the dogs their food. After that, Brian goes to the shelter and drills a hole in the door. Chris asks Brian why he took so long. He replies that he was walking the dogs. Chris, Brian, and Belly then go to the hideout together. Chris tells his son to clean the floor and then sends him outside. He intends to wash the woman. Brian wants to stay and watch, but his father tells him not to. Chris starts cleaning the woman, using very hot water, and asks Belle to bring another bucket. However, Belle just stands there, watching as her husband touches the unfamiliar woman.
Don't look at me like you're jealous. This has to be done.
Belle picks up a board and approaches Chris. She looks into the wild woman's eyes and feels a desire to help her, but at the last moment, she changes her mind and points out a loose fixture in the wall to her husband. Chris thanks Belle and asks her for another favor. He takes the woman outside to prepare a washing area. He ties her to a barrel and begins to wash her. Peggy pleads with her father to stop, but he ignores her. Peggy then turns off the water. Chris and Belle take the woman back to the cellar. Chris insists that his wife dress the wild woman. In the evening, he brings her water and food. The woman, feeling hungry, agrees to eat with a spoon. After her meal, he teaches her a new word: thank you. Peggy's teacher calls their home phone to speak with her parents. She leaves a voicemail saying that Peggy is pregnant, but a girl answers the phone and deletes the message so that her parents don't find out. At night, Chris waits until his wife falls asleep and leaves the house to the street. He goes into the cellar and begins to undress the woman. Brian follows his father and spies on what his father is doing. When Chris gets home, he simply lies down in bed and hugs his wife. Belle begins to cry because she knows where her husband went. In the morning, Belle comes into her daughter's room and says that it's time for her to get ready for school, but Peggy says she won't go to school because she doesn't feel well. In the afternoon, Brian returns home. He thinks that there is no one at home, so he goes to the barn, takes the tools, and goes to the cellar. The guy undresses the woman and begins to torture. Peggy heard screams and runs into the cellar. She tells everything to her mother. Chris comes home and finds out what his son did. Belle tells her husband that their son touched a wild woman. But Chris doesn't scold his son. He says that this is normal, and there is nothing wrong with it. Belle is shocked by what she hears. She says that she no longer wants to live with him and will leave today with her daughters. But Chris hits her several times and Belle loses consciousness. At this time, a teacher from school comes to them. Chris sits Belle down at the table and lets the woman into the house. She tells Chris about Peggy's possible pregnancy, but Chris says that's a lie. This is impossible because he knows everything about his daughter's life. The teacher realizes that Chris is starting to get angry. She tries to leave, but Chris stops her and says that she has no right to come to their house and lie to her daughter about anything. He slaps her in the face and asks his son to bring ropes. Chris and Brian drag the woman along the ground towards the barn. They tie her to the fence. Peggy tries to stop her father, but she fails. Chris approaches his daughter and says that it is her fault for what happened. He calls her all sorts of bad words and pushes her. Peggy runs into the house and finds the key to the cellar. She is going to free the wild woman so that she can help her. Belle comes to her senses and also goes towards the cellar to stop her daughter. Meanwhile, Chris and his crazy son lock a woman in a cage with hungry dogs. The woman tries to hide, but a terrible creature comes out of the booth. Ryan calls this creature his sister. It attacks the woman and bites all over her body. Soon, all that remains of the woman are pieces of flesh. Meanwhile, Peggy has already freed the captive. The wild woman goes outside and sees Belle in front of her. She attacks her and eats half of her face. Afterwards, she goes to the barn and attacks Ryan and then Chris, taking revenge. The woman leaves the barn and tames the dog. She goes into the house and sees a little girl. The woman takes her hand and leads her away. Peggy slowly follows them into the forest to start a new free life. And this is where the film ends.